Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is a video I've been wanting to make for a while. I hope I'll be able to say everything that I want to say clearly. This might be rather long. First, let me begin by saying that I have the belief that, generally speaking, what has always been, always will be. What a people have always been, they always will be. There may be periods of time where they diverge from that, but that's an aberration and they will inevitably return to the character and conduct of their past. The only way this changes is on the individual level. And if enough individuals in a society, in a qawm, in a group of people, if enough individuals change, then the society can change and the nature and the character of the people can change. But the change being made on the individual level must be caused by divine intervention. So yes, in my opinion, the only thing that can or has ever changed what a people have always been is Islam. And I don't think this way out of nowhere. I think it out of observation and study. So, for example, when I look at the West, I don't see any change or evolution from what they've always been. In fact, I see a striking continuity in their present with their past. Recently, I watched the Viking movie, The Northman. I'm not really interested in Vikings, but this film is about the myth upon which Shakespeare based Hamlet. So I was curious. I've also noticed from being online that there is a kind of emergent interest in the Vikings, as evidenced by the fact that this film was produced in the first place. I mean, the online manosphere, red pillars, white nationalists, all of these groups sort of overlap in their interest in and admiration for the Vikings. Manly white men doing manly things. Now, of course, this is a dramatic film. It's not a documentary. But historians and scholars of European history have said that it presents the most accurate portrayal thus far in cinema of the Vikings and Viking society and Viking life and Viking beliefs. So if that is the case, if that is truly accurate, if that is a truly accurate portrayal, then I can say that the Vikings were grotesquely savage people. I mean, there's a scene in the film that's a Viking raid on a village, and it's brutal and gruesome and barbaric. And I couldn't help but juxtapose that scene in my mind with the conduct of the Muslim armies at that same moment in history, and from even earlier, when the Muslim armies were always preceded by emissaries offering treaties, offering peace agreements, when they were armies who followed strict rules of combat, strict rules of war, armies whom their own enemies described them as being knights by day, meaning on the battlefield, and monks by night, meaning they prayed all night. And they said that the Muslim armies never take anything unlawfully, they never enter a place without a greeting of salam, but that they destroy utterly anyone who fights them. These were armies, these were soldiers, whom, when their enemies watched them, we have reports of when the enemies watched them, they thought, wallahi, that they were some sort of new breed of elevated human beings, more like malaika, more like angels than men. So obviously, when watching the savagery and bestial behavior of the Vikings as depicted in that film, which apparently is accurate, I couldn't help but contrast it with the refined civilization of the Muslims at that exact same moment in history. And in fact, it made me think about what I have talked about many times on this channel, the fact that Western civilization isn't a civilization because they never civilized. I do not see any significant evolution in the West from its ancient pagan history through Christianity and through the Enlightenment up until this moment. I mean, tell me the evolution that has allegedly taken place in Western society between a Viking raid on a defenseless village and the shock and awe campaign and invasion of Iraq. They have not civilized. They've just learned more words. I mean, again, consider the fact that for them, the Vikings seem to represent the ultimate embodiment of masculinity until today. They admire that. Listen to Joe Rogan, for instance.
They have some huge human beings. These are leftover marauders. And I think it really is just Viking DNA. Like this idea that there was these giant marauders Huge, giant, mushroomed up men. They're different humans out there, man. Those are Vikings. That is Viking DNA.
It's just the best DNA from the world.
Thousands of years ago, guys like him would be on a boat and they'd have a sword and they couldn't wait to jump off that boat and start hacking people to bits.
Yeah.
That's why that guy exists. That's why he's so big.
He sounds almost aroused talking about the Vikings, not to mention the conspicuously eugenicist notions he has about their DNA. They do not, in their heart of hearts, disavow this sort of conduct. And again, we see how they actually embrace this conduct anytime they go to war, which is all the time. Since one of the biggest controversies in Western society right now is feminism, and there's this claim that feminism is causing huge tectonic shifts in the culture. Let's talk about that. Is there really any shift at all? Because as I see it, there has been no fundamental change in how the West perceives or treats women. Allegedly, because of feminism, women in the West have more power and are more sexually free and liberated and promiscuous than in the old days. Okay, which old days? Presumably you mean the old days of Christian patriarchal power, right? But what about the pre-Christian days? What about the entirety of European history before that little blip of a few hundred years of dominant Christianity? Because, I mean, we can't really say that the church held sway over Europe until around the 10th century, when the Pope was the central figure of power on the continent. And then the Enlightenment kicked off in the 17th century. So that's not that long. But Europeans had some form of religion since at least the Neolithic period. So what were they like back then? Well, among other things, they had goddesses. One of them was called Nerthus, Mother Earth, and she was worshipped in temples around Denmark and Germany, and attended to by priests. Whenever the priest would feel her presence, he would put her idol on a chariot and ride it around the area. Afterwards, the chariot and the idol would be bathed by slaves, and then those slaves would be killed and thrown in a lake. Their folk stories are full of what they call prophetesses, who could read the future, who could see and communicate with spirits, who could heal people, and they were consulted by men in any important issue, and highly respected and highly regarded and feared. Women in pagan Europe were perceived to possess magical spiritual powers and have direct communication with the supernatural, and this was given enormous respect. So what about sexual liberation and promiscuity and so forth? Well, in those days, in pre-Christian Europe, in the pagan days, it's reported by historians that whether a bride was a virgin or not was of little consequence. It's reported again by historians that virginity and illegitimacy were not really important. Historians write that the ideas of fidelity and monogamy that were embraced by converts to the Christian church were not really important to their pagan predecessors. Their pagan gods and goddesses slept around, and so did the worshippers. In a famous Nordic poem, there's a character who says about a woman who commits adultery, "That's harmless. If a woman has, besides her husband, some other lover or someone else, it's not a big issue." How does that not sound like the current day West's position on sex positivity and anti-slut shaming and so on? Now, one of the other things that they talk about with feminism is the divorce rate, right? Well, in ancient pagan Europe, if a woman was unhappy with her husband, she could easily divorce him. Historians report that women would even use divorce as a threat, and what that meant in terms of the wife taking all of the family property with her when she left. They would use the threat of divorce to try to get the husband to do what they wanted. Now, how does that not sound like it could have been written about marriage in 2023? Now, bear in mind, this was the situation at the same time when the Vikings were running around being manly men doing manly things. Now, the perception in Europe of women being magical or supernatural in some way continued even after the Catholic Church eradicated all the priestesses all the prophetesses, all the cults of the goddesses. It continued because all of the priestesses, all of the prophetesses were just reclassified as witches. So the perception of women in Europe didn't change when Christianity came, just the judgment that accompanied that perception. The church just basically taught that women are essentially evil or more prone to evil. According to the church, women were the devil's preferred target because weak understanding and frail faith meant that women were more likely to turn to superstition, more easily deceived by demonic illusions and promises, and sooner persuaded in the end to abjure their faith. Still quoting, inconstancy was a trait that both women and devils had in common. So were ambitiousness and lustfulness. Both were curious and loquacious, mendacious and proud, and vain and greedy, all of which are weaknesses that the devils could exploit. Tell me that that does not sound red pill to you. But this is from like the 16th century. So basically in pagan Europe, women were perceived to have, and certainly many did have, connections with the jinn, fortune-telling, healing, magic, and so on. This was valued and respected and feared by the pagans, but the Catholics saw it as evil. So they were looking at the same picture, but just through a different lens. So they still believed that women had this connection with the jinn and the supernatural, but they saw that that meant that women were just more susceptible to wickedness and to becoming instruments of the devil. So they had the same basic view about women, they just had a different judgment about it. This judgment that reflected a pre-existing, pre-Christian perception of women, this judgment lasted about as long as Christian dominance in Europe. But then you have the Enlightenment and the march of secularism, which just shows that this period of judgment in Europe was an aberration. Christianity in Europe was an aberration. So modern feminism in the West has just actually, to a great extent anyway, just revived the earlier pre-Christian pagan version of what is actually a very consistent Western view of women as strange and dangerous. There has been no evolution in Western thought to fundamentally improve or correct this pre-existing, long-standing, underlying perception. You have to understand this history and what it means. Europe was pagan for thousands of years before Christianity. They were worshipping jinn from around 11,000 years ago up until Christianization, and this molded who and what they are and will always be. It even influenced how they understood, interpreted, and developed Christianity. It influenced how they understood, interpreted, and developed secularism. And it now influences the way they understand, the way they interpret, and the way they develop in areas such as economics, politics, and governance. They have never truly fundamentally changed. This is why I have said that the West has never truly civilized. They are essentially the same as they were in their savage history. And this is why it's extremely dubious, not to mention dangerous, to incorporate any of the ideas and the theories coming out of the West into our own understanding of the world and how we approach life. Wallahi, only if they are guided to Islam can their primordial, embedded paganism ever be genuinely and permanently cleansed from their nature. Jazakumullahu khairan wa assalamu alaikum.